Good afternoon. My name is Ernest Dollar. I'm the director of the City of Raleigh Museum and the M.T. Pope House Museum. I've been a volunteer and employee of Bennett Place for a number of years, about 10 years, in the 1990s, and wanted to kind of talk to you a little bit about the road to Bennett Place, about how these great armies arrived on this small, modest Orange County farmhouse in April of 1865. So today we're going to kind of cover about how these armies moved, sort of the strategies behind them, and sort of the experience between these last days, between April 10th and April 17th in 1865. So we really want to set up the negotiations and how they took place, some of the participants, and to get an understanding of this road to Bennett Place. So sit back and enjoy as we kind of travel back in time to April of 1865. And it all begins here at the Bennett Place State Historic Site in Durham, North Carolina. It seems like an odd choice for two major Western armies of the American Civil War to end up in this small, rural, not even a crossroads, but just a place beside the road in April of 1865. And before we get here, we have to go very far back in time, almost a year, to try to understand how these great armies arrived. And most of it is to do with this gentleman right here, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. In May of 1864, he, along with the other Union armies pushing south, launches a campaign to try to drive toward Atlanta, Georgia. It was sort of a great rail hub of the South. And to do that, he has to do a series of marches and counter marches to try to get around his Confederate adversary who's in his way, and that is Major General Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. We'll talk about it in a minute. But when Sherman steps off in May of 1864, it is a long route to arrive at Bennett Place. So Sherman drives to Atlanta and captures the city on September 2nd of 1864. He stays in the city for a while and develops this crazy plan, which he goes to the Union authorities to say, hey, I am alone in the deep South. Let me march across Georgia and not only attack the Confederate infrastructure, but also the mind of the South in hopes of bringing them to their knees, to dissuade them from supporting the war effort, to draw away those natural resources that are fleeing to the battlefields of Virginia. Union authorities reluctantly allow him to do this march, to march through the interior of the South. So he leaves Atlanta on this, what we have known today as the Great March to the Sea. And by December, he arrives and captures the city of Savannah, an incredibly successful march that does quite a bit of damage to not only Confederate infrastructure, but also Confederate morale. Once he arrives in Savannah, he is ordered to board his troops by boat, carry them to Virginia, and help break the siege of Petersburg, which is currently underway by Ulysses S. Grant. He surrounded Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in the trenches of Petersburg, and the Union authorities say the combination of Sherman and Grant's army will overwhelm and finally break the siege. Well, Sherman has another plan. Due to the great success of his march to the sea, Sherman floats an idea of marching overland to Virginia to join Union forces there. Again, another audacious plan to march through the very heart of the South, which was largely unimpeded. So in January of 1865, he does just that. He launches his army of about 60,000 men into South Carolina. Confederate authorities struggle how to figure out where Sherman is going. Is it Charleston? Is it Augusta? So all of these movements keeps the Confederate off balance. On February 17th, he arrives and captures the city of Columbia, the capital of South Carolina, and moves on. His goal ultimately is the rail hub at Goldsboro, North Carolina. This would allow him to receive supplies from moving inland along the railroads, along the Cape Fear River. So this is his ultimate goal. Now, as we said earlier, opposing Sherman through North Georgia was Major General Confederate General Joseph Eggleston Johnston. Both Sherman and Johnston were both West Point men, graduated about 20 years apart. Johnston, the class of 1829, and Sherman, the class of 1840. Johnston did his best to try to stop Sherman through North Georgia, but ultimately could not stop these series of outflanking marches all the way from North Georgia to Atlanta. The gates of Atlanta, he's removed by Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who disliked Johnston from the very beginning due to his inability to stop Sherman. So Johnston is put into early retirement. But seeing how Sherman is marching across the South unopposed, the Confederacy is desperate to find a way to stop Sherman as he's approaching North Carolina. Davis reluctantly recalls Johnston to duty at the bequest of General Robert E. Lee. Johnston sees the writing on the wall, and he is upset that he is recalled to duty to act as a scapegoat in his mind, to surrender the South. Out of a sense of duty and honor, he rejoins the Confederacy and is tasked with the daunting goal of putting together some type of army that will stop Sherman. And he does just this through the months of January and February and early March. He pulls Confederate forces from all four corners of his department of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia and Florida to put together some ad hoc army to try to stop Sherman. He lays a good plan, and in the March of 1865, he launches a trap which was designed to destroy one of Sherman's arms of his army marching through North Carolina. The result was a battle of Bentonville, which was pretty much a 3-day standoff, no side really getting a clear victory. And this was the last Confederate gamble to stop Sherman. After the battle, both armies retreat. Johnston pulls his army to Smithfield, and Johnston moves on to Smithfield, and Sherman moves on to Goldsboro, his ultimate goal. Now, as the two armies are lying about 28 miles from each other, preparing for what move is next. Now, most of the fighting we're going to see in this last road to Bennett Place is done by the cavalries of both sides. This is a picture of General Joseph Wheeler, who was in charge of most of Johnston's cavalry during his march, his army of Tennessee. Now, Joseph Wheeler and his men were some of the only troops that had opposed Sherman all the way from North Georgia to Atlanta, from Atlanta to the sea, and up through the Carolinas. So his men had been in the saddle for over a year. And the cavalry of the Army of Tennessee, especially under Wheeler, had gained a notorious reputation of being very lawless, very demoralized. These men were some of the roughest characters of the cavalrymen of the Western Theater. And this is some of them pictured here, some of the most notorious men of the 8th Texas Cavalry. Now, as Sherman is marching through, especially South Carolina, North Carolina, these men really would grow frustrated at their inability to stop Sherman and really began to start unleashing a very ugly guerrilla warfare on a lot of Sherman's scouts and some of his bummers and foragers, often leaving them executed by the roadside with placards hung around their neck. So these men grow incredibly desperate in the last days of the war, as we'll see. Now, Wheeler's reputation for the lack of control of his men had become notorious across the South. So in February, as the Confederate authorities are pleading with Robert E. Lee to send some support to help stop Sherman, the only people he can send is General Wade Hampton, seen here, with a small contingent of cavalry. But what they did is they elevated Hampton to lieutenant general, very high rank, in order to outrank Wheeler, in hopes of Hampton could somehow control Wheeler's reckless men. So these are two very prominent Confederate cavalry commanders who are on the scene trying to stop Sherman, and we'll see they play an integral role in this last days of the war. Now, Sherman also had his own cavalry, but each force was roughly equal for about 5,000 mounted men on each side. The Union cavalrymen were commanded by this gentleman, Hugh Judson Kilpatrick, another West Pointer like Johnston and Sherman and Wheeler. Kilpatrick graduated the class of 1861, so the last class before the war. Kilpatrick earned a notorious reputation in the Eastern Theater and earned the nickname Kill Cavalry because of the recklessness with the lives of his men. When Sherman was looking around for a cavalry commander to take over his mounted branch as he moves to the South, he chose Kilpatrick. Now, Sherman knew and often said that he knew Kilpatrick, and one time even called him, quote, one damned hell of a fool. but knew he had the fighting spirit, but was reckless. So it was a trade-off. In coming days, Kilpatrick's recklessness would really drive the final nail in the coffin of the Confederacy. Now, the men under Kilpatrick's command were Westerners, Ohioans, some Pennsylvanians, Michiganders, men who had served throughout the war in a Western theater. So, like their counterparts, they too had been in the saddle for almost a year and had grown weary and worn down by the months of constant combat. So as we see them moving through, especially South Carolina, it is an ugly war between these two mounted groups, which kind of grows into a tit for tat execution of the soldiers. So it is perhaps one of the darkest chapters of the Civil War moving through South Carolina. Now, here's the situation immediately after the Battle of Bentonville. And this is sort of central North Carolina and kind of gives you a real glimpse of the theater for this last major campaign of the American Civil War. Sherman makes his way to Goldsboro with his 60,000 men and is met there by 20,000 more men. He's joined by the 23rd Corps and the 10th Corps, which brings his entire force to roughly 89,000 soldiers camped around Goldsboro. Johnston, as you can see in this map, pulled back to the town of Smithfield. Now, his force continues to fluctuate some, or right around 32 to 36,000, as more troops that are still coming in who didn't make the Battle of Bentonville arrive to join his newly reorganized Army of Tennessee in Smithfield. Now, most people in North Carolina were unsure of Sherman's next move. According to the plans, he'd be moving north along the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad that goes north out of Goldsboro, headed toward Virginia to join Grant in around Petersburg. So Johnston's actually acting as a shield between Sherman's force and the state capital of Raleigh in North Carolina. But all that is about to change. This is an eyewitness drawing of Union soldiers in Goldsboro learning the most incredible news they had never thought they would hear. And that would be the evacuation and the fall of Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. So while Sherman is in Goldsboro, he does travel to Virginia ahead of the fall of Richmond to meet with Admiral David Farragut, Ulysses Grant, and Abraham Lincoln to talk about what the end of the war would look like. And this was the last grand strategy meeting that Sherman had with Lincoln and Grant. So once this news of Richmond reaches his troops, there's a great, glorious celebration. And this picture really doesn't belie just how wild Union soldiers got about hearing this news. But what it did, though, it alleviated the need for Sherman to march north to join Grant. Instead, Johnston's Army of the Tennessee is the largest remaining Confederate force in the field. So Sherman understands if he could destroy Johnston's army, the South would really have no leg to stand on. So not so much the capture of Petersburg, when that is taken off the table. It is truly the destruction of Johnston's army is the number one goal, this new goal of Sherman's army. So instead of sighting their sights north, they set their sights west and eyeing Raleigh and moving along the North Carolina Railroad to try and catch Johnston before he can escape back into the deep South. But Robert E. Lee's army is still on the move, moving west from Petersburg. Now, Johnston's perspective that although that Richmond has fallen, Lee's army is still out there. And if they can move west and turn south, they can combine their forces around Greensboro, which would give the South combined army and a chance to really either destroy Sherman's force or Grant's force. And this is the last trick in the deck of cards the Confederacy has to play. So Raleigh is nervous now. Hearing this news, they begin to feel that they are truly in the eye of the storm. And this is a great image of Raleigh's earthwork. In 1863, due to some federal incursions on the coast before, people in Raleigh became nervous. And throughout the summer of 63, winter of 62 and spring of 63, the Confederate authorities impressed enslaved men from across central North Carolina to come to Raleigh and build this huge earthwork that surrounds the city. So Raleigh felt they had some protection, but under the weight of the mass um, army that Sherman had and seeing what he had done throughout the South, they grew increasingly nervous that the Confederacy's ability to try and stop Sherman. And of course, what loomed largest in the minds of people in central North Carolina was the news of the burning of Columbia. Refugees, newspapers, rumors, stories, letters all brought tales of the great destruction that Sherman's army had unleashed on Columbia, the state capital of North Carolina. And many worried, would the capital of North Carolina suffer the same fate? Now, the morning of April 10th, the great armies of Sherman and Johnston begin to move. The morning of April 10th, Sherman sends a force north to try to throw the Confederates off balance, to make them believe that he is indeed moving to Virginia. And they move up the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad. But it doesn't take long before Sherman sends his forces on their real target, moving west. And this is the route of the 20th Corps, one of Sherman's corps moving out of Goldsboro, heading west. Now, ultimately, all of his men are going to be moving west as well. But what he does is that he believes that Johnston will make a final stand outside of Raleigh. The great Neuse River, which snakes around the capital, is a perfect defensive line. And you can see it at the bottom of this map as it moves northwest toward Raleigh. So Sherman lays in plan a strategy to somehow outflank what he perceives would be Johnston's line of defense. South of the Neuse River, using it as a screen, Sherman sends the 23rd Corps, 10th Corps, and Kilpatrick's cavalry. So the feel is that as his main body is moving up the north bank of the Neuse, they would hit Johnston's defensive line, while all of these forces moving to the south would actually outflank and get behind Johnston's army. So Sherman believed that if Johnston wanted to put up a fight, he had just the plan to take care of him. So the rainy morning of April 20th, they start moving out. Most of the defenses the Union soldiers run into are cavalry forces under Wheeler and Hampton, who are acting as sort of the rear guard for Johnston's army. Seeing and learning reports of Sherman's army on the move, Johnston puts his men into motion as well. They begin moving west from Smithfield, again, to try to hook up with Lee somewhere. And communications begin to get spotty with Lee, who is desperately fighting for his life, moving west in Virginia. And as communications break down, Johnston is left in the dark to know where in the world these two forces would combine. So he's moving a little blind west in hopes that somehow this plan they concocted would somehow fall into place. Now, throughout the first day's fighting, again, most of the Confederate cavalry are doing the resistance. They're burning bridges. They are trying to stop Sherman's columns, slow them down, and buy some time for the Confederate army to move west. But on at midnight on April 11th, the telegram in Johnston's headquarters begins clicking away. And it is there they learn the bad news that Robert E. Lee has been surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. An incredible blow to Johnston, who is left trying to be dumbfounded on what exactly to do. Now, the news will arrive the next day to Sherman and his men on April 12th. Scores of diaries and letters talk about how the news arrived. And again, the celebrations, especially on the heels of the fall of Richmond, the destruction of the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, as these forces are moving closer to Raleigh on April 12th, it is when Sherman's trap sprung. Johnston decides not to defend Raleigh and keeps on moving west. But this flanking force of Kilpatrick's cavalry does manage to get in behind of the retreating Confederate horsemen who are trying to screen Johnston's army. And there's severe fighting below Raleigh along Swift Creek. And in the middle of this skirmish, Union soldiers hear about the fall of the capture of Robert E. Lee, and they just burst into song and cheers amidst the battle. Now, two of the casualties are these two gentlemen right here. On the right is Dick Eustis, who is with the Jeff Davis Cavalry out of Mississippi. And on the left is Samuel Baker, of the 9th Pennsylvania. Both of them were killed in the fighting of Swift Creek. Now, sadly, Eustace was injured in the spine and left on the field, so none of his comrades knew what happened to them. And his family didn't know either. So months after the war, they're advertising in Raleigh newspapers any information about the whereabouts of their dear departed family member, Dick Eustace, who's still buried somewhere around Raleigh in an unknown grave. But all of this fighting outside of Raleigh makes more people in the capital city more nervous. And there's a great exodus of people leaving the city. But coming into the city are these two gentlemen. On the left is former governor and senator William A. Graham, and on the right, David L. Swain, another former governor of North Carolina. Now, these two men had lived in the farther west in the Piedmont, in Hillsborough and Chapel Hill. But they too had saw this great juggernaut rolling toward them and these great warring armies destroying so much of the infrastructure of North Carolina. Now, these two men knew just how North Carolina, how hard they had to fight to build up its infrastructure, its railroads, its roads, its universities. Both of them had been Whig governors in the 1830s and 40s and fought hard to bring North Carolina out of the sleepy doldrums of the state that it had been grown into after the American Revolution. So they were very worried to see all they had worked for, their entire lives' work, destroyed by war. And they felt that something had to be done. Both of these men rode to Raleigh and met with the current governor of North Carolina, Zebulon Vance, and convinced him to make peace with Sherman, send an envoy, send a letter, surrender the city. They didn't want to see it ended up like Columbia, nor any of the state university in Chapel Hill, or all of these great things that made North Carolina a modern state. Vance agreed, but convinced the two men they could go meet with Sherman and ask for quarter, but encouraged them to keep this mission as quiet as possible. Well, on April 12th, they made their way out of Raleigh, boarded a train, and rode directly into the advancing army of Sherman. They are stopped by Confederate horsemen under Wade Hampton, who allows them to pass before receiving news that they are not allowed to make peace. News of their mission had reached Joseph Johnston, who ultimately said, no, this cannot happen. Recall these men. We cannot have North Carolina making a separate peace with Sherman, but it was too late. Swain and Graham took their train, rode it right into Sherman's advancing army. They were captured, went to go meet with Sherman. Sherman agreed to spare the capital and spare the state university. They had done their job and tried to save North Carolina. But Sherman asked them to stay on the night of April 12th. It was too dangerous for them to go back to Raleigh as these armies were skirmishing. So they agreed to stay the night in Sherman's camp, which would have some interesting backlash the next day. So that night, on April 12th, Raleigh's in a panic. The Confederate army is retreating. Panicked people are trying to prepare for occupation and possible destruction. The Confederate cavalry under Wheeler spend the night terrorizing the town, riding up and down streets, breaking into stores, and just a night of lawlessness. On the morning of April 13th, Swain and Graham prepare to beat the army, Union Army back into Raleigh. They want to be there to ensure that there's a peaceful transference of power and that the Union Army honors Sherman's request for a truce. So that morning is prepared to reboard their train and drive back into Raleigh. General Judson Kilpatrick approaches them and says, I have heard that Sherman has agreed to surrender the city, but if I meet any resistance, they'll be hell to pay. Swain and Graham assure him that they'll take care of everything, and they race back into Raleigh. Graham and Swain jump off the train. Graham heads out to make his way west to try to make preparations to preserve the university, while Swain marches up to the steps of this building. This is North Carolina State Capitol. And as he's sitting on the steps on the right-hand side of this picture, the southern steps of the Capitol, looking down Fayetteville Street, preparing to surrender the state to Union authorities, he sees a very dangerous situation unraveling. he sees a group of these lawless Confederate horsemen under Wheeler ride in, tie up their horses, and begin breaking into a jewelry store right across the street. Swain knows this is bad news, that these men could endanger this very fragile peace that he has risked his life to make. So he marches over to these men and tells them, hey, the Union Army is coming right up the street in just a few minutes. You guys now have to get out of here. Well, these troopers are enraged by this sort of cowardness demonstrated by Swain of surrendering the city, and scream back at him, damn city and damn Sherman too, they care for neither. And it's just about that time when they hear the strains of Hail Columbia and see Kilpatrick's parade moving up southern Fayetteville Street heading toward the Capitol. Most of these men jump on their horses and speed away to join most of the other Confederate cavalry, which are just camped just west of Raleigh. But inexplicably, one sits on his horse and waits for the parade to get close. He pulls out his pistol, begins firing it, and dashes out of town. But before he can get far, his horse falls and he's recaptured and brought back to the grounds of the Capitol, where a very angry Kilpatrick is waiting for him. He's asked, why did you violate the truce? And the young man said, well, I didn't know of any truce. And he's begged for 5 minutes to write his wife. It was cruelly denied before Kilpatrick turned to his men and said, take this man out where none of the ladies can see him and hang him. That's one version of the story. But there was another eyewitness on the grounds that morning that saw the whole thing. Millie Henry was a slave who was gathering water on the grounds that morning, and she saw the Confederate cavalrymen fire away, saw him escape, and brought back for Kilpatrick. But she says a very different story. When asked who he was, the young man said, I'm Robert Walsh of the 11th Texas Cavalry. Why did you violate the truce? And in Millie Henry's story, the young trooper says, because I hate Yankees and wish they were dead in a pile, which was the worst thing to say because Kilpatrick had been finding his men executed by Texas cavalrymen over the previous months. This enraged Kilpatrick. Turned to his men to take this man out where none of the ladies can see him and hang him. But in Millie Henry's version, Walsh begins to laugh incessantly, starts laughing maniacally, says, thank you, sir, thank you, as they take him out and he is hung. So this is his headstone today, which is in Oakwood Cemetery. Now, the strange things about Robert Walsh is that when we check the rolls of the 11th Texas Cavalry, there is no Robert Walsh. So who was this lone, desperate trooper who defended Raleigh and paid for his rash but noble deed, according to post-war Confederate writers? Now, to give you a quick look about what the Confederates are doing, this red line represents Johnston's retreat west. Again, he's following the railroad in order to sort of take advantage of all the storehouses of goods and supplies he's stacked along the way and to move faster. But at the town of Morrisville, he splits his force to move even faster to divide them on separate roads. So this is the path Johnston is taking. Now, as the Union authorities start to move into town, Kilpatrick has orders from Sherman, and he's basically let off the chain with the orders to push the Confederates and push them hard. To keep up the feint that Sherman is going to follow Johnston on his direct path, but he's not. Sherman is going to try something sneaky. Now, he certainly has more men than Johnston, and this is almost detrimental to a very fast pursuit. Johnston is moving along the railroad, his men are smaller, and they can move faster. So Sherman is going to try to send his forces to the south to race them on a parallel course, hopefully catch Johnston in Charlotte to prohibit him from escaping the state. So these are these fingers that begin to go down to the south as Sherman begins to swing his men south. But the fighting that is done on April 13th is pretty vigorous, and it goes all the way from Raleigh to this town of Morrisville. And again, it is truly a one long battlefield between the Confederate and Union mounted men. Kilpatrick only spends 30 minutes in Raleigh. He runs up the Union flag, establishes a force to watch the city, and then pushes out after the Confederates. Now, the Confederates, who've been fighting Kilpatrick for months, understand what kind of man Kilpatrick is, that he would want to rest in Raleigh, rest on his laurels, and really just drink in his victory of capturing another Confederate capital. But that's not the case. So Confederate soldiers are right outside Raleigh. They take their saddles off. They begin cooking breakfast on April 13, not thinking that Kilpatrick will move out after them. But if you read the letters and diaries, that morning they could hear the ground rumbling. And before they knew it, the Union cavalry was amidst them. They pushed out and just attacked this Confederate camp, hacking with sabers and firing pistols. And in one soldier's account, it was the worst stampede he ever seen. The Confederates are caught completely off guard and have to run pell-mell to try to reorganize themselves to launch a counterattack to stop this Union push. But this sets up the entire day's fighting as it begins to roll west. And it's touch and go. Confederates would build barricades and put up a defense, but they'd be overrun and keep falling back. The Union, Kilpatrick's horsemen were reinforced with artillery and really kept this running back and forth battle throughout the afternoon. When they get to the town of Cary about 1 o'clock, there's a lull in fighting while Kilpatrick puts his fresh units in front, his 1st Brigade, and brings up new artillery of the 23rd New York and pushes it out again. They successfully gnaw at the rear of Wheeler's retreating cavalrymen, capturing wagons and leaving dead Confederates along the way. So it is truly an ugly, random, almost hand-to-hand combat as they start rolling west. Now, the Confederacy had been evacuated Raleigh in the previous days, and they had brought out all of these supplies and left them at all of these little small depots along the North Carolina Railroad. Go send the engines back to pull out more of the badly needed supplies the Confederacy needed. Also, the wounded was pulled out from Raleigh's hospitals. So they tried to leapfrog as much supplies and wounded as they could to keep them out of the Yankee hands. But the aggressiveness of Kilpatrick and his men just began to overwhelm all of these stations and begins to capture what the Confederates cannot haul away. Now, as they arrived at the small railroad town of Morrisville, where Johnston had divided his force, the Union Army sees a very lucrative treasure waiting for them. At the town depot is a very long train with boxcars that is not moving very fast up the slopes out of this town. And they see a chance to put another feather in the hat by capturing this train. Confederates are in the town around the train depot, desperately trying to organize a defense, as this guy, Lieutenant Joseph Kittinger of the 23rd New York, pulls up his battery and begins shelling the town. And this is one of the cannonballs from the shelling that was discovered in the 1990s in Morrisville. As Kittinger and his battery are shelling the town, Kilpatrick pulls up 3 regiments for a charge on the train. So they desperately want to capture this to take the train out of use by the Confederacy and capture anything that's on the train. Now, in amongst the town is this house, the Williamson Page House. And if you would have been here in 1861, you'd seen a much different scene, as it was a staging ground of the local Confederate company, the Cedar Fork Rifles, who left to go fight in the fields of Virginia in July of 1861 at the Battle of First Manassas. So this is where they had their grand send-off in May of 1861. And I'm sure none of them who were there that day realized that war would literally roll back to their doorsteps. And if you go to this house today in Morrisville, this chimney on the right shows extensive damage from the fighting that took place there this afternoon, April 13th. Now, the Page House is labeled on this map as Jerry Morris's house, but this is where it is in context of the battle. These green lines are what I suspect was the train that was trying to make its way out of the depot. And the Confederacy had 2 lines of defense. They had to split their forces to act as rear guards for the splitting of Johnston's army. So you have 2 positions to the south and to the west covering these roads out of town. And of course, around the depot, Wheeler had desperately thrown up a defensive position to try to buy some time for this train to escape. Well, when the charge is sounded, Kilpatrick's regiment dash for the train. Throughout the day, the Confederates had no luck in keeping the Yankees away, but behind these makeshift barricades, they're able to pour enough fire on the charging Federal soldiers that it blunts their attack only 150 yards from capturing the train, and they're repulsed. But the Confederates have to make a great decision here. Are they going to let everything be captured, or do they need to uncouple some of the cars to let this train escape? Now, on this train cars are, again, badly needed supplies of food, telegraph wire, supplies the Confederacy cannot afford to lose. But on the other hand, also attached to this train are the wounded, those wounded comrades, those Confederate soldiers who have been injured at Bentonville, who they're trying to make their escape. Wheeler makes a fateful decision. He tells his men to uncouple the cars with the supplies, keep the wounded attached, and hopefully they can escape. Before King Kilpatrick can organize another charge, the lightened train makes his way up and escapes toward Durham Station. The Confederates pull back, uncover the town, and let the Union soldiers come in that evening. Now, fighting dies down during that evening as each side settles down to lick their wounds and reorganize. Now, around midnight, Union pickets north of the city see an incredibly strange sight. Two Confederate soldiers, an officer and a private, carrying a white flag, approach Union lines, and they have a note. Notes given to the pickets, and the soldiers are brought back to Kilpatrick's headquarters in Morrisville. Upon reading the note, Kilpatrick cannot believe what he's reading. It is a note from the overall Confederate commander, Joseph Johnston, asking for the opportunity for an armistice. Peace is at hand. And this note had actually been dictated by Jefferson Davis, who met with Johnston in Greensboro days earlier, when Johnston said, "The gig is up. We must sue for peace under the best possible terms." So Johnston and Davis's note arrives at Kilpatrick and is instantly sent back to Sherman, who has now occupied Raleigh. But even the following days, this does not end the fighting immediately. The two generals send these notes back to back as they try to arrange what this truce would look like. It does take time, and sadly, many more will die before an actual armistice is achieved. In the morning of the 14th, Kilpatrick again starts his aggressive pursuit. He has to split his cavalrymen to follow the retreating Confederates. He, along with his 1st and 3rd Brigade, go north along the railroad, going through Barras fields and actually heading toward Durham's Station. He sends a 2nd Brigade through the swampy lowlands, heading toward Chapel Hill. And this road is much more lightly used. It's more swampy. And this is a road that the Confederates are very nervous to protect because it offers the Union Army a chance to get under this arc. And the screening that the 2nd Brigade does, moving the swamp, actually is trying to screen the movement of Sherman's infantry that sort of move to the southwest and move west. So they're trying to screen to keep the prying eyes of the Confederate cavalry to realize what Sherman is up to. So the fighting along this road that cuts through the New Hope Creek Basin heading toward Chapel Hill does get fierce at times. Now, the notes come in that the Sherman says to Johnston that he would love to meet somewhere at a point between the two armies, and he will stop his advance from Durham Station and in Chapel Hill. And this begins sort of the farthest advance of the Union cavalry. Sherman freezes his infantry in place, and Johnston agrees to as well. His rear headquarters of his cavalry are at Hillsborough, while the main bulk of his army is scattered throughout the Piedmont, around Burlington. Company shops was known at that time, all through the country as they're trying to move their way west. Now, this is the old library at the Smith building on the campus of University of North Carolina. The soldiers take over the university and actually stable their horses here. And the joke goes in Chapel Hill that the odor of horses lingered for many years in this building, where they actually brought their horses in and used the library as stalls for their horses. It is an incredible moment where these two armies freeze in place for several days. They really think about what the future will be. Will the war really be over? What's going to be the fate of the nation? And on April 17th is when Johnston and Sherman decide that this will be the day to meet. They don't know where, just somewhere between the two armies. Johnston, who is in Greensboro, takes a train back to Hillsborough, meets with his cavalry commander, Wade Hampton. In the morning of 17th, gets his escort and begins riding back down the way his army had marched, somewhere between the lines. Sherman does the same. He boards a train in Raleigh and is about to take it to Durham Station when the telegraph operator runs down and says, "General Sherman, I've just received a cipher dispatch from Morehead City. I think you should read it." Sherman waits for a moment and the telegraph operator reappears, but his face is white as a sheet. He hands Sherman this note and he reads it and his face wilts. It is the announcement of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He puts it into his coat pocket, swears the telegraph operator to secrecy, goes on to Durham, meets Kilpatrick, and begins moving west. And the two meet on the Hillsborough Road, not far from the small, modest farmhouse of James Bennett, where over 3 days, incredible negotiations take place that really shape the future of America. So that's a little bit about how both armies arrived at Bennett Place. It's an incredible story that gets so little press in many of the history books, but it is a very important and very pivotal time that leads up to these great negotiations out at Bennett Place. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Again, my name is Ernest Dollar, and thank you for watching.